You know, in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 15, just one verse here for just a moment. I was preparing to do a message out of this chapter, but it took a slight change this week. But listen to this, because it helps us see as followers of Christ the challenges that we can face in this life as we faithfully follow him. In Luke chapter 15, verse 1, it says, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear him, but the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, 'This man welcomes sinners and eats with them.'" Wherever Jesus went, there was a group of people who just could not handle his message. They struggled with who he was identifying himself with and what he was doing, and as he was reaching out to bring forth ultimately the message of life by way of his life. As you faithfully follow him, there may be things that you'll do that can cause a rather challenging response, and I experienced that this past week. I was here at Man Alive last Saturday morning, but I came knowing that later that morning I would be stepping into a unique situation doing a funeral. Now, I do many, many funerals, and many of you who are here today, I've been involved in the precious time of honoring your family member, and I'm committed to that. But this was a unique one because it dealt with a personality that is viled by many and reviled and considered one of the most evil men to have ever lived. His name was, of course, Charles Manson. And I felt like it's important to share with you a little bit of that story because two things. Number one, it's an incredible story that truly will lead right into our time of baptism. But secondly, it's important because a story like this takes on its own life. And there have been some misconnections on communication with organizations that share these things. I have to tell you this, and I want to invite my friend Les to come up here. But while he's coming up, just one of those things that this thing was awfully quiet, and I hadn't talked with anybody on Sunday about it. Just a few people knew, and I brought the staff in on Monday morning to share with them what I had done so that if they got any word on that they would be able to give an answer to it. But this was a secret time because we recognized that it would be a challenge if the word got out well before, right over here, Les, got out before we were quite prepared for that. But as many of you know, it got out very, very quickly. And so one of the parts of the story, one of the earliest ones was, Les, that from Fox News, that they talked about the fact that Charles Manson's service was being done at the Church of the Nazarene in Porterville. Actually, they thought at this particular facility, but that's not correct. Now, for you who may not know, this is Les Peters. He is our head usher, first hour, but he is also the owner of the Porterville Funeral Home and Crematory, which just so happens to be our previous facility. And so there's a big question. Why Porterville? How did this funeral service get here in town?
It was a long route, actually. You know, I heard, like most people, that Charlie Manson was sick, Charles Manson. And one of my first thoughts about it was Larry Williams here goes to church, and he and I were talking when Mr. Manson was taken to the hospital in Bakersfield, and we knew he was gravely ill. And I didn't realize that he had been a guard for Charles Manson. And he started talking to me, and he was recalling some stories. He had actually known he said he called him Charlie. So all of a sudden I thought, well, that's an intimate relationship. And he was one of his guards. I think he said he was a billet guard. Is that right, Larry? A billet guard, whatever a billet guard is, but he was in charge of him. So we got to talking, and that was my first thoughts. He hadn't passed away yet. Mm-hmm. So I didn't think much of it. But then Mr. Manson did pass away. I guess it was November 19th. Right. And it must have been 2 months later that my nephew, my family's in the funeral business, and I grew up here in Porterville, and my dad worked at Lloyd's. And then back, I guess it was when I was just finishing my sophomore year up, my dad bought the funeral home in Shafter, and so I finished up my schooling there and worked for my parents for 22 years. And I worked with my sister. We bought the funeral homes, and now my nephew owns a funeral home in Shafter and Wasco and Arvin, actually. And he gave me a phone call, and he said, Les, I need to talk to you about something. I've been asked by the grandson to consider doing the funeral for Charles Manson. And he was very, very concerned. There's, you know, whenever you got a business, my pager keeps going off. Sure.
People seeking to have a service at your facility.
Yeah, keeps vibrating. I guess that's better than ringing. So anyway, my nephew was very concerned because he'd been talking with the grandson, and the grandson said, I think I'm going to get possession of my grandfather's remains, and I want to do a cremation service. And that's the first I'd heard of it. And so we talked about it for a while, and the good and the bad. Shafter's a lot smaller town than Porterville. And so everybody seems to know you over there. And so we just talked about logistics, and I just told him, be very careful. I said, but if you need to use a crematory, you can use mine, because he doesn't have one, and he knew he would need one. So I guess it was, and that was all. We didn't talk about it anymore after that. And then a week before Mr. Manson was to be released from the coroner's office, I get a phone call from an attorney, and I think it was an attorney. Yeah, an attorney. I have all these, in my phone number now, I have attorneys and producers and cameramen, and then, of course, the next of kin. But he said, well, we want to talk with you because your nephew recommended you. And so I did agree. We'd go ahead and do the service. But that was how it came to Porterville, was just through my nephew's relationship. And I've got to tell you, too, that the way it came to my nephew was a little bit of a story, too, because it comes like all funeral homes. You know, there's a local connection somewhere. And the grandson, he had grown up in the city of Dover, Ohio, I think. And he and his wife were from this little community. It's about the size of Lindsay. And so they went to their local funeral director and said, what do we do? You know, we're not sure what to do. We got Grandpa's passed away over there in California. We have no idea who to go to. And so they're Christians. The funeral director was a Christian. And so he started looking for a funeral home in California and touched base with my nephew, and eventually to us.
So Les, here's an important question. What kind of criteria do you have in place on whether you accept a funeral or to do a funeral service for a family or not?
Well, they come to us. That's the criteria.
So in other words, you basically don't say no if a family seeks to come to your facility to do a service.
Never said no to any family ever.
That's
and
right.
I guess, like I said, I'm second generation. I've been a funeral director since I was 15, and 40-some years now, 45 years now.
Because in reality, you're ministering to the family.
Yeah, and in truthfulness too, we really don't. I mean, the funeral focuses on the person who passed away, of course, but that's not who I'm talking to.
Yeah,
you know, I'm talking to the family. I'm going through everything with them and what they think is how they want to handle things.
Wow. So, because there were a lot of people who were asking, you know, why Porterville, and did they have family members here and so forth. So all these things were going out in the news media and so forth. But here's something that just came up this past Friday morning. I had to return a call to one of our previous parishioners who's married to our district superintendent on the Los Angeles district, Leslie Garman, who's a Leslie Kalk. And Leslie was back in Boston, Massachusetts, and she had just been visiting her brother. Those who know the story, her brother is Joel. He's incarcerated back there for life. And he had not heard about Manson's passing, but Leslie began to share with him and the fact that it took place here in Porterville. And this was Joel's story to Leslie, and she had to just share with me. She says, you know, Joel and Charlie served at Vacaville for a period of time. And he says, actually, we became pretty good friends there and talked all the time. And Joel said, and I shared with him everything about the Porterville Church of the Nazarene. He began to go back to Walnut and C, to the youth that would meet down in the basement. He talked about getting married in the Henderson Avenue Church and all these things dealing with the Porterville Church. He says, Charlie knew about us many, many years ago. And then Reverend John Denny shared with me just about his relatives. There were a couple relatives in Charlie's family that early on in the 30s had attended the Church of the Nazarene back in the Midwest. So it wasn't because of Charlie attended there that it came here, but those are just pieces of the story that come together for this. And so here we are. Les, as he does on a number of occasions, he called me a week ago Thursday and said, Pastor, I have a unique service, and I want to see if you would be available to do that. And he mentioned Charles Manson, but then he said, but Jason is the grandson who's working on this, and he is a Christian. That was a very, very important conversation, because as you are in the business of doing funerals, so as a pastor, one of my responsibilities is to be available for services with families going through the sadness and sorrow of separation. So I knew that that's just something I do, and to look into this would be rather different, but important, but it made a big difference knowing that Jason was a part of that. Now, you had to keep this under your hat for how long?
My nephew called me, it was a good month and a half before the grandson was given actual possession to make a decision. So I didn't realize that I would be involved, though.
Yeah, right.
I just had counsel with him. And then it must have been about 3 weeks prior to the release that I actually got the call from the attorney wanting to know if I would participate. Mm-hmm. So Kim and I did a lot of praying. My wife, Kim, stand up so everybody knows who you are.
There's Kim right here, yes.
She is very important. I follow directions. People think that I'm the face of the place, but that's the person who really runs it. So anyway, it was very important to keep it quiet. We prayed long and hard. We knew that we did not want people coming over to the funeral home and protesting and picketing and things. And, of course, the family didn't want that either.
Right.
That's not good for any situation. So, and one of the things that the family wanted to do, too, we found out is Jason is doing a documentary of his journey to meet his grandfather. And you probably know more. He did a lot of studying. He did a great service, by the way. Like everything else, he really looked into the background. I didn't do that. I just followed directions. So, anyway, I found out through this whole process that Jason had never met his grandfather. And it was very important to him to document it. And Jason, I think he worked in the oil fields. He lost his job in November, like 4 days after his grandfather passed away. And so I'm not really sure what all the motivations were, but he was doing a documentary, and it was kind of scary to think. They told me right away, hey, we're going to have a family or a film crew with there every point of the way. As soon as you go to the coroner's office, when you bring him back to the funeral home, when you have the funeral, everything's going to be a film crew there. Yeah. And so I hadn't had that before, but we had to decide, too, if we wanted to be involved in that, because that meant later on when this thing gets on TV and it's sold or wherever it's going, that there would be more exposure, and it could be bad exposure.
Yes.
I mean, a lot of people are not...
There will be some bad exposure, I will let you know.
Okay. So anyway, but we decided we would go ahead and get involved.
And that happened as we met on Friday with the family, and as Les mentioned, Thursday night, I just spent some time looking up Jason and finding out about his life, because I wanted to understand his journey. And through that, I found a lot about the pulse beat of this man who was attempting to connect with someone whom was only known by name, but now understood to be his grandfather. And so as we met together, we began to talk through this service. And so the heart's desire was, what could we do about a person like this, and to provide a service that would truly minister to the family. And so here we are. Larry is there because they're wanting him to share stories about his time with Manson in prison. And Les is there conversing with him about other details, and I'm trying to talk to him about the service. But this was a key factor. The story goes like this. It was 8 years ago that Charlie had talked to one of his outside friends to try to figure out what had happened to his son. He had a son by the name of Charles Manson Jr., who he left his family when he was very young, and he changed his name. And then through life, it just was so challenging. Jason shared that he felt that his dad took his life, suicide, 1992 at the age of 33, just because he couldn't handle being a part of that. And Jason said to us, he says, it's full circle. Our desire is that we would be able to find a way through this to come full circle in our relationship. He said, and I shared this in the service. I said, Jason, his grandfather, Charlie, his dad was not a part of his life at all as he was a young person. And of course, Jason's dad left him. And so there was no father there. And so Jason said, but I want to break the pattern of the past and be full circle. I said, Jason, you've just shared with me what will be the focal point of this service as we gather together. So we came together, and I want you to know, I just do this with any family, but I read a daily devotional that is Jesus Today, and it just so happened to be these words for this past Saturday. So here it goes. This is like Jesus speaking to us. Nothing in all creation can separate you from my love. Pause and ponder what an astonishing promise this is. You live in a world where separations abound, wives from husbands, children from parents, friends from friends, childhood dreams from adult realities. But there is one terrible separation you will never have to face: isolation from my loving presence. I want you to cling to me with tenacious confidence. This gives you strength to cope with the uncertainties of living in such a broken, unstable world. Anxious thoughts can assault your mind and fill you with fear if you forget that my love will never fail you. When you find yourself feeling afraid, grasp my hand in childlike trust. Rest in the protection of my presence, and remember that perfect love drives out fear. The greatest wealth on earth is minuscule compared with the riches of my boundless love. Yet this is my free gift to all who follow me. How priceless is my unfailing love. I mean, think about that. With these 25 people who are gathered for this service, many of them did not really know each other before they came in. There were some that were connected with Charlie over many, many years. But in reality, they were a bunch of strangers. And yet we had the opportunity to preface the service with those words coming from Jesus. And then, Les, as we were sitting there talking with them, we were learning, and I said to them, I have to tell you that I cannot focus on Charlie Manson's activities of his life that was such a challenge to our world and what he is known for. But I said, I'll do some broad strokes. And so I focused in on this, and you've heard it many, many times. Every choice you make, there's positive results and negative consequences. And I said, Charles Manson was born into an unhealthy environment where he was given birth by a 16-year-old prostitute who was ill-prepared to be a mother. And in that, she hardly even attempted to do just that. And he was thrown around to different relatives, and many of them, in a sense, abused him. And so there were many choices thrusted upon him that brought about a destructive activity and a negative pathway for him to go. And then, of course, we all know later on in life, he himself made choices that negatively impacted many people for many, many years. But then this is what really got to me. Here's Jason, who is not calling him by the name of Charles or Charlie, but saying grandfather. And so as we gather together, I said, as we think about who this man is in the correctional system, he was known by this ID number. But here he is known as son, and as husband, as father, as grandfather, as great-grandfather, and as a number of those who were there as a friend. So this is your opportunity to share your final goodbye and pay your final respects. But then we went into Jason specifically, and I said, Jason, you're here, though, because it's your greatest desire to break the pattern of the past. The scriptures talk about the curse of generations, the generational curse that goes on. And it really just deals with the fact that in some families, often there is the ongoing process of negative choices that truly bring destruction in the lives of people. And I said to Jason, today, that ends. That this is the start of a brand new beginning. And that's really how we had into this service. And then we went from there, and Les had it all set up for us to do something that most of you probably aren't familiar with, but they desired to, quote, view the cremation. But explain to them what that's all about and how many people even do that.
In our community, it's actually got to be very diverse. We have a lot of families now that cremate it. More than 50% of our families do cremation and do burial. And when we put together the funeral home over at the old church, we had in mind we wanted to do something for this community that does cremation. And in a way to put it, in a way you might recognize, you know, if we do kind of a traditional funeral like we used to, we'll have our funeral ceremony, then we'll all place the casket in the hearse, we'll drive over to the cemetery, and then we'll have our graveside service. And a lot of our Catholic families, it continues after that. Our church, kind of the tradition is when pastor says amen, we pass by the family, shake their hand, and we come back here for a meal. Our Catholic families, they'll go ahead, they'll lower the casket, they'll throw dirt on the casket, they'll stay until it's completely covered. That's their tradition, to follow through with everything. And our Buddhist families here in town, they focus on ceremonies, and they will do the same type of service we'll do in the chapel, but then instead of carrying the casket out the hearse, they'll carry the casket outside to our crematory. And we've designed in the crematory, it's the old daycare center, and it's pretty good sized rooms. So we've actually designed a little viewing chapel with a big window. And I think the chapel will seat about, maybe 45 people in there. We set some chairs up in there. And so the pallbearers carried the casket over and placed it on our little loader, just like at the graveside. We have a lowering device. At our funeral home, we have a loading device that goes in, and we call it a retort. The crematory is the building, the retort's the actual chamber where the cremation occurs. And so our Buddhist families, they'll go all the way. Just like we say a prayer at the graveside, they say a prayer right there as they're about to place the casket into the retort. And then instead of seeing it lowered, we let them, part of their tradition back in Laos and these other areas, is they push the casket into the retort, they push the buttons, and they say their final prayers, and that's the end. So that's how we designed this, and that's pretty much what we did here. Right. I wouldn't have known the sequence of how to do those things if I hadn't done so many Buddhist services and things were. And so I kind of designed it after that, to tell you the truth.
But very meaningful to those who were there. And so that was a service later on in a very private place. They took the remains and scattered them. But then the story takes off. Little did I know that it would get out as quickly as it did. But I want to say thank you to many of you. There's been a number of you who have texted me and emailed me just stating that you've appreciated the actions we took, but more importantly, you said that we have your back. And I have to tell you, we need that, because there are a lot of people that are not as pleased with what we have done. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to share this with you, for your awareness about what had taken place. Monday was an incredible day. After I shared with staff thinking that it would slowly get out, all of a sudden I'm getting ready to go to another funeral, and I get a call, and Tina says, there's someone on here from TNZ. Well, it wasn't TNZ. Actually, I got on the phone with him, and I said, who is this? And I said, TNZ. No, TMZ. I said, what do you do? And she shared with me that they get information out. Little did I know they already had a report out there with a picture of Manson, as well as an open folder of our service with my name and our church name there for all to see. That is not really a good thing.
You notice my name wasn't in there.
Your name was not in there, Les, I tell you what. Yeah. But later on, I shared with her the story, and she was pretty good with what she put, except for a couple things. She had the headlines where pastor has clear conscience. There was never a clear conscience, never zero qualm. I had another interview with Channel 47 and 24, and the gentleman asked me, he said, did you struggle at all with this? I said, can I tell you the conflict? I said, think about this. You have victims that have experienced the travesty of what took place under this man. They're living with this their entire life. And I'm standing before this knowing how that can be perceived. but also knowing that Jason was a guy who's following God, and he and Audrey needed a pastor to stand with them. Monday went on like that. Call from Associated Press, and then we had Bakersfield, Channel 17, and then 24 and 47. They came over to interview me in my office. And even on that, if you saw that, just a couple things. He asked me, what about the afterlife? What do you think? And I said, well, let me tell you, this is key. I said, can I remind you that I'm not the judge and you're not the judge. Only God is the judge. And let me tell you what I shared with the family. I shared with the family that Jesus loves us with all the love he has up until the very last moment we have. That's something he does for all of us. And I mentioned in that article, I said, based upon his actions, he would not be on a pathway to heaven. But Jesus' love continued to flow towards him until the very end. Who knows what happens there? Now, they didn't put all that in the article. They just had the last portion. But we need to understand that we live in the presence of God who does not want anyone to perish. But yet, as I shared with them at the service, I said, his love continues to reach out to all of us. The key to that is we must reach back to receive that love. And that's the key factor to that whole interaction there. But it's continued to take off. I've had a bunch of my pastor friends who've called me, one from New Jersey, another one from Delaware, who are just sharing their desire to be supportive. The whole group of guys and gals I go with on the leadership cruise were behind us and are aware of the fact that I would be sharing it with you this morning, because they are praying that this would be something that could be honoring of God above all. But I think, Les, we're about ready to enter into baptism here in a moment, and I've thought about this. What's baptism all about? Chad mentioned it. It's the fact that it's the one sacrament that God calls us all to participate in, and it deals with death and life. That as you go under the water, you're dying to yourself, and as you come out of the water, you're rising in new life to Christ, and it's our public testimony about who Christ is and what it is. And as I thought of Jason and Audrey, breaking the pattern of the past and beginning a new start, that he can be the father of his 3 boys, that he can provide the spiritual dynamic to allow them to have an environment where they can grow in their faith. And that's what we think about as we think of baptism. These candidates we're going to have will be, you'll be able to hear their testimonies. And it just joins in the line of what it's all about. But I got to tell you, when you walk with Jesus, you're going to be a target for those who have no interest in Jesus. And can I tell you this? That's all right. It doesn't matter. We need to be faithful to that pathway. That's what Palm Sunday is all about. And as we go through to Maundy, Thursday, and as you will join me next Sunday for the greatest celebration of resurrection in Jesus Christ, it's about following him, not popularity, not the things that go with attention given because you do a service, but the attention you give to your personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Do I have an amen on that? Amen. Hey, can you give a hand to Les? Thank you, brother. Love you.